I speak now to Antony Loewenstein. He's an independent journalist and author of the Palestine Laboratory. He joins us now from Sydney. Thank you for your time. That 24 hours that the Israeli army gave over 1 million Gazas to move from the north to the south, that deadline is now more or less up. What do you think is going to happen next?
I think Israel's going to go in. And it's interesting, I've seen in the last half an hour or so, some Israeli officials say that there's never actually been any US pressure to really alter that deadline. In other words, there was talk from some UN and other human rights organisations that the whole concept of trying to move 1 million people, more than 1 million people, within a war zone, and as you've been reporting, even when some Palestinians did move, they were killed by Israeli forces from the air. So it's a completely incomprehensible idea, and I fear in the coming hours or days, we don't know exactly when, there'll be a ground invasion. It's going to be overwhelming. I fear it's going to be something akin to shock and awe like the US did in Iraq. And I think what's really missing from so much of the understanding in much of the West on this issue is what happens after this ground invasion? What exactly is the plan here? And I've been reading a lot in the more kind of saner Israeli writers, certainly Palestinians, of course, and even some in the West, a handful who are actually saying this, that it's really up to the only country that can actually potentially stop a complete and utter catastrophe is the US, and they have no interest or intention of doing so, which may be because they've learnt nothing themselves from guerrilla wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Some sort of ground incursion has already begun. That's what we're hearing from the Israeli army. What would that have been in aid of? Because we know that it involved infantry and tank units, but we don't know much more than that.
We've read a few reports that Israel have got back some hostages. I don't know exactly where that was from, but they certainly got some hostages back. The vast majority of these hostages, we don't even know the exact number. I mean, there's never been an official count of both Israeli Jews and foreigners. 100, 150. They're inevitably going to be spread out around the Gaza Strip. Some potentially have even been taken out of the Strip. I don't know that for sure, but it would not surprise me. And they're also not just being held by Hamas, they're also being held by Islamic Jihad. So the idea that you're going to find them in tunnels or in basements is going to be unbelievably difficult. This is going to be an ugly, street-by-street guerrilla war. And the record of Israel and the US, for that matter, in these kinds of wars is disastrous. Iraq and Afghanistan, within weeks, Saddam and the Taliban were overthrown. That was not the issue for the US. The issue was the guerrilla war. When Israel went into Lebanon in 1982, it was a complete catastrophe, a guerrilla war, and they were kicked out essentially with the tail between their legs in 2000. When Israel went into Lebanon, went into Gaza in the last 15, 20 years, none of these wars were, in inverted commas, successful. They were disaster, obviously, for the Palestinians, of course. And I've been to Gaza a number of times as a reporter, including a few months after Operation Cast Lead in late 2008, early 2009. And that was sort of the first of the new round of terrible wars between Israel and Hamas. And entire neighbourhoods were levelled. I mean, often we're hearing on Al Jazeera, but not so much in other Western news networks. What does it actually mean for civilians who can't go anywhere? I saw huge amounts of Palestinian civilians who were living in rubble. They essentially had nowhere to go. They were living in the rubble of their homes. And what's missing, I think, from so much of this, and I say this as someone who's Jewish, I'm an Australian and a German. I've lived for many years in East Jerusalem as a reporter. And it seems like there is such an appetite, bloodlust, a demand for revenge, backed entirely by the West. And there's so few sane voices, particularly in the Jewish community and, frankly, the wider community. In the US, there are critical Jewish voices, to be fair. Jewish Voice for Peace, If Not Now, two really interesting groups that are trying to put pressure on the US to stop Israel's inevitable disastrous invasion.
You touched on this. Israel has vowed to dismantle Hamas and has also signalled out its political head in Gaza. I mean, how realistic a mission is this?
Well, look, within Gaza itself, I think it's possible if you can cause absolute carnage, you can possibly eliminate huge amounts of the Hamas infrastructure, probably a lot of the Hamas leadership. But let's not forget, most of the Hamas senior leadership are not in Gaza. They're across the Arab Muslim world. And as I've been saying for the last few days, I very much think that Israel will restart in the coming months and years a global assassination campaign, which they did many years ago in the 70s and 80s against their perceived Palestinian enemies. I think a lot of those Hamas leaders will be looking over their back and going into hiding or moving to places like Iran or Syria because they won't be safe in the nations they're in now. Look, going street by street in Gaza when huge amounts of civilians are there to try to find hostages or eliminate Hamas infrastructure, it's going to be unbelievably difficult and bloody. And again, the ultimate question is, with Netanyahu and a so-called coalition government in Israel who have a record of causing absolute carnage across Palestine for years, there's no indication, literally zero indication, and some saner heads in Israel are saying this. What is the plan the following day? What is the plan when you potentially overthrow Hamas, assuming you can? Does that mean the Palestinian Authority? Does that mean Israel comes back and controls the area with settlements? This is just this sort of rushed move for vengeance, and it's going to be devastating for Palestinian civilians. And I see most of the Western world not just turning a blind eye, but in fact encouraging this bloody adventure.
Antony Loewenstein, independent journalist and author of the Palestine Laboratory. Thank you.
Thank you.